Why do intelligent, successful people repeatedly find themselves trapped in relationships with manipulators, narcissists, and emotional abusers? The statistics are staggering. Research shows that individuals who escape toxic relationships often find themselves in similar patterns within months, as if drawn by an invisible force they cannot consciously control. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist, discovered that this phenomenon goes far deeper than simple bad luck or poor judgment. It stems from unconscious psychological processes that operate like magnets, drawing us toward precisely the people who will recreate our deepest wounds. Sarah's story illustrates this trap perfectly. At 32, she possessed everything that should have guaranteed healthy relationships: a successful marketing career, close friendships, emotional intelligence, and years of therapy. Yet her romantic life resembled a broken record, playing the same devastating song on repeat. Each new relationship began with intoxicating chemistry that felt like destiny, only to spiral into emotional chaos that left her questioning her sanity. The pattern first crystallized when she met Ryan at a friend's wedding. He commanded the room with magnetic confidence, sweeping her into late-night conversations that felt electric with possibility. Within days, Sarah found herself canceling plans with friends to be available whenever Ryan called. The intensity felt romantic, even spiritual. Surely this was what love songs meant when they spoke of souls connecting across crowded rooms. Yet within weeks, subtle red flags began emerging like cracks in a beautiful facade. Ryan dismissed her opinions with a charming smile that somehow made disagreement feel like personal failure. He critiqued her clothing choices, her career decisions, even her laughter, always with just enough affection to keep her hoping for approval. When she needed emotional support after a difficult day at work, he would vanish without explanation, only to reappear days later with elaborate romantic gestures that made her feel guilty for having doubted him. Sarah found herself walking on eggshells, editing her thoughts and feelings to avoid triggering his mysterious moods. She rationalized his behavior as stress, trauma from his past, or simply the complexity of a deep soul. Their chemistry remained undeniable. When Ryan showed kindness, Sarah felt like she was flying. When he withdrew into cold indifference, she felt like she was drowning. This emotional roller coaster became addictive. The highs seemed worth any price. For example, after a week of his silent treatment following a minor disagreement, Ryan would surprise her with an expensive dinner and passionate declarations of love. In those moments, Sarah felt chosen, special, worthy of a love that could overcome any obstacle. She told herself that fighting for their connection proved her commitment, that lesser women would have given up, but she possessed the strength to love him through his walls. When Ryan abruptly ended things with a curt text, "This isn't working for me," Sarah plunged into a despair that surprised her with its intensity. She replayed every conversation, dissected each interaction, and promised herself she would never fall for someone so emotionally unavailable again. Yet within months, she found herself captivated by Lucas, whose brooding intensity and creative passion seemed to promise the depth she thought she craved. Lucas, too, alternated between overwhelming devotion and harsh criticism, leaving Sarah perpetually off balance. He would spend entire weekends worshipping her as his muse, only to disappear for days when she needed consistency. Like Ryan, he possessed an uncanny ability to make his problems feel like her responsibility to solve, his moods like weather systems she was somehow supposed to predict and navigate. The realization that struck Sarah like lightning came from an unexpected source, a quote from Carl Jung she encountered during a late-night internet spiral. "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The words felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. For the first time, Sarah began to wonder if her repetitive heartbreaks reflected more than terrible luck or a scarcity of decent men. Perhaps some unconscious magnet within her psyche was drawing these toxic partners into her orbit, an inner pattern she had yet to recognize or understand. As Sarah began to examine her attractions through this new lens, disturbing patterns emerged. The men who made her heart race all shared certain qualities. They were emotionally unavailable, critical, unpredictable, and somehow always in need of saving. Meanwhile, the kind, stable men who showed genuine interest left her feeling bored, suffocated, even contemptuous. It was as if her romantic compass pointed only toward emotional disaster. Jung's insights suggested that her attractions served as mirrors, reflecting qualities she had disowned within herself. The control she found so compelling in others masked her own desperate need for certainty in an uncertain world. The volatility that excited her reflected her own unacknowledged inner chaos. The emotional unavailability that kept her chasing reflected her own terror of true intimacy. This revelation marked a turning point in Sarah's journey towards self-understanding. She realized that breaking her toxic relationship patterns would require more than better boundary setting or improved partner selection. It would demand exploring the unconscious forces that shaped her attractions from within. Her journey would lead through the terrain of psychological projection, the hidden complexes that hijack adult relationships, and the magnetic pull of the shadow self that Jung identified as central to human psychology. Sarah's awareness of her toxic relationship cycle sparked a crucial question. Why did she so often fall for partners who mirrored her deepest insecurities? Carl Jung's theory of psychological projection offers an answer. Projection occurs when individuals unconsciously attribute their own disowned thoughts, feelings, or impulses onto others, experiencing them as external realities rather than inner dynamics. In relationships, projection can create powerful and often destructive attractions, as people are drawn to partners who embody the very qualities they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. According to Jung, the psyche divides into conscious attitudes and unconscious contents. The conscious mind favors socially acceptable traits, confidence, warmth, stability, while deeming other aspects inferior or unacceptable. These disowned elements slip into the unconscious shadow, where they continue to influence behavior covertly. When Sarah met Ryan, she admired his seemingly effortless self-assurance, unaware that her attraction stemmed from her own concealed need for certainty. By projecting her desire for control onto him, she felt drawn to his leadership but failed to see that this admiration masked her fear of taking charge in her own life. Projection often operates through a closed feedback loop. When Sarah perceived Ryan's intermittent kindness as proof of his genuine worth, she ignored his controlling behaviors. His inconsistency mirrored her inability to trust her own judgment, a pattern rooted in childhood messages that her feelings did not matter. Rather than confronting this wound, she projected self-doubt onto Ryan, interpreting his coldness as evidence of his fickleness, rather than recognizing it as a trigger for her abandonment fears. Illustrating projection's power, Sarah found herself angrily accusing Friday, a colleague, of being uncaring and dismissive, only to discover that she had been treating him similarly. When confronted by a friend, Sarah realized that her impatience with Friday reflected her own impatience with herself. She had been berating herself for past mistakes while expecting perfection from others. This moment underscored Jung's principle. Traits vehemently criticized in others often reflect our own inner conflicts. Projection can also fuel relationship drama by creating illusions of compatibility. Sarah believed she shared a profound spiritual bond with Lucas because he mirrored her own hidden desire for transcendence. Yet this sense of unity masked her reluctance to confront everyday emotional needs. In Lucas, she saw her own suppressed yearning for meaning, projecting her idealized self onto him. When Lucas failed to live up to this projection, Sarah felt betrayed not by him but by her self-illusion. Moreover, projection is not limited to positive qualities. Sarah often sensed undercurrents of anger or contempt in her partners, triggering fear and avoidance. However, these feelings belong to her as much as to them. Jung taught that the projected shadow can only be reabsorbed through conscious recognition. When Sarah began to notice her own jealous thoughts, rather than blaming Lucas for flirting with another woman, she realized that her jealousy stemmed from her unacknowledged fear of abandonment. Acknowledging this allowed her to confront the genuine need for security within herself, rather than projecting it outward. Projection can also manifest as a form of emotional contagion. Sarah found herself inexplicably anxious around certain ex-partners, convinced it was their anxiety spilling over. Yet her mounting panic during their visits revealed her own underlying anxiety, triggered by unresolved childhood insecurity. The partner became a living mirror, reflecting emotions she had never fully processed. As Jung noted, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Sarah's fate in love seemed doomed until she confronted these unconscious projections. To interrupt projection, Sarah learned to practice self-observation and pause before attributing motives to others. When a surge of irritation or attraction arose, she asked herself, what part of me is acting out through this person? By internalizing her projections, she started reclaiming disowned traits. Recognizing her own need for validation reduced her compulsion to seek it externally through domineering partners. Admitting her impatience with others softened her inner critical voice. Projection also thrives under stress, when the ego feels threatened and resorts to splitting the world into friend or foe, desirable or repellent. In moments of conflict with Ryan or Lucas, Sarah's mind labeled him entirely good when he soothed her, but entirely bad when he withdrew. This black and white thinking masked the complex interplay of both partners' feelings. Jung maintained that recognizing this complexity requires accepting that no person is wholly one thing. Each contains a mixture of light and shadow. As Sarah became more adept at spotting projection, her relationships shifted. She stopped obsessively analyzing partners' every word for hidden meaning and instead tuned into her own emotional reactions. When Lucas criticized her choices, she paused to notice her pain, asking, "What wound is this touching?" Rather than retaliating or retreating, she owned the hurt as her own, diffusing the power of his words. Breaking projection's spell also demands developing the capacity for nuance and embracing emotional complexity. Sarah practiced tolerating uncertainty, acknowledging that she might misinterpret someone's actions and that others' behaviors did not always reflect her worth. This fostered emotional resilience and decreased her unconscious need to project control onto partners. In summary, Jung's projection theory illuminates why Sarah repeatedly attracted toxic partners. She unconsciously magnetized individuals who embodied her disowned traits, creating powerful, self-reinforcing cycles of attraction and conflict. By recognizing projection and reclaiming disowned elements of herself, she began to disrupt this pattern, drawing in partners not to satisfy unconscious needs, but to share authentic connections based on mutual wholeness. Beneath the surface of projection lies another force binding Sarah to toxic partners: psychological complexes. Jung described complexes as emotionally charged clusters of ideas and memories centered around a theme, such as rejection or powerlessness. These complexes operate like autonomous subpersonalities, reacting to triggers with disproportionate intensity. In relationships, complexes magnify minor slights into dramatic threats and hijack rational judgment, perpetuating destructive patterns. Sarah discovered her most potent complex after a turbulent date with Lucas. He had cancelled their weekend getaway at the last minute, citing work pressure. Instead of viewing this decision within its context, different priorities, genuine stress, Sarah experienced it as a personal betrayal. Her heart pounded, her vision narrowed, and memories of past abandonments flooded her mind. In that moment, the abandonment complex seized control, flooding her with panic and self-recrimination. "He doesn't care. I'm unlovable." Rational thoughts evaporated, replaced by a desperate need for reassurance and pledges of fidelity that only fueled Lucas's resentment. Complexes form early in life when painful experiences become split off from conscious awareness. Sarah's childhood offered fertile ground. Her mother's inconsistent affections left Sarah unsure whether she was worthy of love. The young Sarah learned to anticipate rejection, and each minor parental absence caused terror. Those early wounds crystallized into an abandonment complex programmed to perceive any hint of withdrawal as catastrophic. Rather than seeing Lucas's cancelled plans as a normal compromise, Sarah's complex sees the event as proof of her unworthiness. Complexes also distort perception by creating selective memories, highlighting evidence that confirms the complex's narrative while ignoring counterexamples. Sarah racked her brain for times Lucas missed her calls, whereas his caring gestures faded from her awareness. Even when Lucas apologized sincerely and proposed rescheduling, her complex whispered that apologies were a sign of weakness or manipulation. Her perception became skewed, sustaining the illusion that Lucas intended harm. Jung likened complexes to soldiers of fortune within the psyche. They defend their domain fiercely and demand attention. When a complex is triggered, it can dominate the personality, flooding the mind with obsessive thoughts and reactive emotions. Sarah noted that after a minor disagreement, she could barely concentrate at work, her anxiety so overwhelming that tasks seemed impossible. This engulfing quality convinced her that Lucas's absence was a dire emergency, warranting any effort to regain his affection, even if it meant sacrificing her own boundaries and self-respect. Complexes seldom emerge alone. Often, they intertwine, creating tangled knots of emotional reactivity. Sarah's rejection fears paired with a worthlessness complex. When Lucas criticized her tone during an argument, she didn't interpret it as a miscommunication. Instead, both complexes conflated, depriving her of perspective. She believed she was unworthy of love and that any critique confirmed her essential flaws. This compound effect produced paralyzing shame that drove her to compensate by overpleasing and self-blame. Understanding complexes requires recognizing their background scripts. Jung emphasized the importance of tracing a complex's origin through dream symbols, active imagination, and free association. In therapy, Sarah began recording her dreams, noting recurring images of empty rooms, locked doors, and shadowy figures beckoning her to enter. These nocturnal symbols drew her to revisit the same emotional territory. She felt locked out of affection, as though an aspect of herself remained shut away. Bringing a complex into conscious awareness weakens its grip. Sarah practiced naming her complexes as if they were separate characters. Here comes abandonment, knocking at the door, and worthlessness is whispering again. This playful externalization gave her space to observe rather than automatically react. She found that the more she could describe her complex's patterns, how it intensified at the slightest sign of distance, the less power it wielded over her. Moreover, complexes thrive on projection. When Sarah projected her abandonment fears onto Lucas, she fueled a dynamic in which he inevitably withdrew, feeling suffocated by her demands for reassurance. In response, Sarah's complex interpreted his withdrawal as further proof of her unlovability, creating a vicious cycle. Breaking this loop required her to accept responsibility for her projections and differentiate her inner drama from Lucas's actual behavior. Jung offered therapeutic techniques for complex integration. In active imagination, Sarah dialogued with personified aspects of her abandonment complex. In a quiet room, she closed her eyes and visualized a small, frightened child holding a broken heart. She addressed the child gently. "Why do you believe you will be abandoned?" The image responded with fragments of memories: a mother distracted by work, a friend who moved away, a teacher who dismissed her creativity. By listening without judgment, Sarah allowed the wounded child to express its pain rather than remain trapped in unconscious reactivity. Another method involved the 3-2-1 shadow work, adapted for complexes. Sarah chose a specific conflict with Lucas, the cancelled plans, described it in third person to detach emotionally, then imagined speaking directly to her complex in second person, confronting its assumptions. "Why do you think he will never come back?" And finally embodied the complex's perspective in first person. "I feel terrified when I'm left alone." This structured approach granted compassionate access to her fears and gradually reduced their intensity. Complexes lose their autonomy when they are integrated into the broader self. Sarah complemented her inner work with tangible self-care, setting firm boundaries around communication, scheduling therapy sessions as non-negotiable, and cultivating interests outside relationships to affirm her value independently. Each time she chose to wait calmly for Lucas rather than panic, she reinforced her agency over the abandonment complex. Peer support also accelerated her growth. In a women's circle, participants recognized similar patterns in their love lives. Hearing others describe compulsion to chase partners and uncontrollable jealousy normalized Sarah's experience. Within the group, she practiced expressing vulnerability, receiving empathetic feedback instead of judgment, and learning that her fears were common rather than shameful. Over months, Sarah noticed a shift. She still felt her complexes stirring but could observe them without being consumed. When Lucas cancelled plans, she acknowledged disappointment but also recognized her capacity to adapt. "I feel hurt, but I know I am lovable even if he needs space." This balanced response reflected complex integration, neither denial nor overpowering distress, but coexistence with inner conflict. Jung taught that individuation involves embracing all parts of the psyche, including complexes, rather than trying to eradicate them. This acceptance fosters a more resilient self, capable of loving without negating personal boundaries or sense of worth. As Sarah's complexes integrated, her relationships changed. She no longer gravitated toward emotionally erratic partners, but instead became open to individuals whose stability matched her growing self-awareness. In summary, Jung's concept of complexes reveals why people like Sarah unconsciously recreate toxic relationship dynamics. Complexes formed from childhood wounds hijack perception and behavior, projecting inner turmoil onto partners and perpetuating destructive cycles. By identifying, naming, and dialoguing with these complexes, individuals can reclaim autonomy, break the loops of projection, and establish relationships grounded in conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. As Sarah peeled back layers of projection and complexes, she encountered a deeper force pulling her toward toxic partners. The shadow's magnetic attraction, In Jungian terms, the shadow contains the disowned parts of ourselves, impulses, desires, fears, and traits deemed unacceptable. While often conceived as dark or undesirable, the shadow also harbors creative potential, vitality, and qualities necessary for wholeness. Tragically, individuals frequently attract partners who embody these shadow aspects, unconsciously drawn to the very traits they refuse to accept within themselves. Sarah's shadow contained two salient elements: her hidden rage and her suppressed spontaneity. Raised in a household where calm politeness was enforced, she learned to squelch anger lest it disrupt the family harmony. As an adult, she prided herself on being agreeable and composed, but beneath the surface lay a simmering anger that erupted in passive-aggressive patterns. Simultaneously, Sarah's spontaneous side was muted by a fear of vulnerability. She saw spontaneity as reckless and unsettling, preferring control and predictability. When she encountered Ryan's volatility and Lucas's impulsivity, she felt drawn to the freedom they symbolized. Their capacity to speak in heated bursts, make rash decisions, and sweep her off her feet contrasted sharply with her own cautious restraint. In moments of passion, she surrendered control, allowing herself to feel alive in ways her habitual self-denial prohibited. Yet this liberation came at a price. Both men's unpredictability triggered her abandonment and worthlessness complexes, provoking anxiety and self-doubt. Jung described this dynamic as the unconscious inclination to recreate shadow elements through relationships. The shadow manifests in the world by surfacing in other people, enabling individuals to encounter disowned aspects as external projections. Sarah saw Ryan's volatility and blamed him for her distress, not recognizing that the volatility reflected her own disavowed anger. By falling for him, she inadvertently set up a relationship wherein her shadow could play out until it demanded integration. This shadow attraction often follows a pattern called repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate painful experiences until they are resolved. Sarah's childhood memories involved sudden parental outbursts, shouting matches born of repressed anger. By choosing partners with unpredictable temperaments, she unconsciously invited replays of those early family dynamics, hoping that this time the narrative would end differently. Yet without conscious integration of the shadow, each new relationship replayed the same script: sudden conflict, emotional blackout, and frantic attempts at repair. Shadow attraction also exploits unmet needs. Sarah's unacknowledged anger carried a message: your boundaries are being violated, but you never stood up for yourself. Ryan's domineering behavior activated that suppressed fury, forcing her to feel something she habitually denied. Lucas's spontaneous withdrawals exposed her own tendency to withhold spontaneity, leaving her to grapple with a loss of aliveness she had never permitted herself to experience. Understanding shadow attraction begins with recognizing that toxic partners often mirror the very qualities that provoke intense emotional responses. Sarah initially labeled her reactions to Ryan's anger as overreactions, convinced that if she could simply manage her responses better, the relationship would improve. However, Jung would argue that such reactions point directly to shadow content seeking acknowledgement. By treating her response as a pathology rather than a signal, Sarah perpetuated the cycle of attraction and conflict. To illustrate, consider a moment when Ryan criticized Sarah's suggestion for a weekend getaway, calling it stupid and childish. Sarah, numbed by years of suppressing her own desires for adventure, felt a surge of indignation that shocked her. She had always deemed spontaneity immature, but his mockery ignited a spark of rebellion. The anger burned so brightly that she momentarily contemplated ending the relationship. Yet she interpreted this impulse as irrational fury and buried it again beneath apologies and attempts to accommodate his preferences. This suppression of her spontaneous self, mirrored in Ryan's derision, exemplified Jung's principle that the shadow's calling manifests through external figures. If Sarah had honored her anger and questioned why spontaneity felt forbidden, she might have recognized her shadow calling and taken a healthier path. Instead, the desire for adventure and freedom projected onto Ryan made him irresistible even as he hurt her. Breaking the shadow magnet requires conscious engagement with disowned traits. In Sarah's case, she began to experiment with controlled spontaneity. She booked a last-minute weekend trip alone, refusing to consult Ryan or Lucas in advance. She allowed herself to dance without concern for judgment, to speak unpopular opinions, and to express anger calmly but firmly when boundaries were crossed. These acts of self-expression reintroduced her to the very parts of herself she had exiled, reducing the need to see them mirrored destructively in others. Jung's technique of active imagination aids shadow integration. Sarah visualized a younger version of herself running freely through fields, then approached this image as an inner ally. She asked, "What do you need to thrive?" and imagined hearing, play, risk, and freedom. By dialoguing with this aspect, she reclaimed spontaneity as part of her identity, rather than projecting it onto unpredictable partners. Similarly, she confronted her hidden anger by creating a rage ritual in a private space, safely and without harming anyone. She expressed her anger physically, hitting a cushion, shouting unfiltered emotions, and journaling her resentments. This cathartic release honored the shadow's power without resorting to destructive behavior in relationships. Over time, the intensity of her reactive outbursts diminished, as she no longer needed to project anger onto partners to feel its force. Shadow integration also involves balancing opposites. Sarah worked to combine her natural patience with healthy assertiveness. In conversations with friends, she practiced stating her needs directly. In meetings at work, she voiced disagreements without guilt. These small acts reshaped her internal map, showing that anger and spontaneity could coexist with her core values of empathy and responsibility. Awareness of shadow attractions transformed Sarah's partner selection. She began to notice when potential partners displayed traits that activated her shadow, and paused to examine her internal responses. Rather than diving headfirst into tumultuous relationships, she created a cooling period before committing, allowing initial chemistry to settle and observing whether her attraction was fueled by mirror responses to disowned aspects. As Sarah reclaimed her shadow, she noticed a remarkable shift. She felt less compelled to rescue or be rescued by partners. The allure of emotional roller coasters faded in favor of steady, balanced connections. In her next relationship, she met someone whose stability complemented her newly embraced spontaneity. Their interactions included adventurous outings and deep emotional authenticity without the destructive extremes she once found irresistible. Jung's warning remains clear. The shadow exerts an unconscious pull, seducing individuals into relationships that replay and intensify inner conflicts. Only by bringing these disowned aspects into conscious awareness can one break the pattern, replace toxic attractions with authentic connections, and achieve relationships grounded in wholeness rather than distress. Breaking free from unconscious patterns of toxic attraction demands deliberate work to reclaim one's wholeness and build genuine connections. Drawing on Jungian principles, Sarah embarked on 5 key steps: cultivating self-awareness, integrating projections, healing complexes, embracing the shadow, and forming conscious relationship habits. These practices, woven together, formed a robust framework for transforming her love life. First, Sarah deepened her self-awareness through mindful reflection and journaling. Each morning, she spent 10 minutes tracking emotional reactions from the previous day, moments of jealousy, fear, or inexplicable attraction, and noting their contexts. Rather than blaming partners, she focused on identifying internal triggers. What in me flared when Lucas cancelled plans? Or why did Ryan's criticism feel like a declaration of my worthlessness? By systematically mapping her emotional landscape, Sarah began to spot patterns, such as heightened anxiety whenever a partner exercised independence, revealing unconscious needs for validation and control. Second, she practiced projection interruption through real-time self-inquiry. When Sarah felt irritation or fascination toward a partner, she paused and gently asked herself, what quality am I attributing to them that belongs to me? If she noticed anger in Lucas's words, she examined whether she denied anger in herself. This pause created a space between stimulus and reaction, allowing her to reclaim disowned traits and reduce the magnetism of projection. Over time, she found herself less enamored with volatile partners and more drawn to emotionally balanced individuals who reflected her conscious growth. Third, Sarah engaged in targeted complex healing via therapeutic techniques. Recognizing that her abandonment complex still drove her panic during relationship uncertainty, she worked with a Jungian analyst to explore early life memories, patterns of attachment, and self-worth deficits. Through dream analysis, she uncovered recurring motifs of empty houses, symbols of perceived emotional vacancy that pointed to her core wounding. Integrating these insights, Sarah practiced affirmations grounded in compassion. I am worthy of steady, loving care. and, more importantly, tested this belief in real interactions by setting boundaries when partners' behavior triggered her fears. The fourth step involved conscious shadow integration. To reclaim her suppressed spontaneity and anger, Sarah adopted creative and somatic practices. She attended improvisational theater classes, allowing herself to enact sudden, unplanned responses, and returned home exhilarated by small acts of self-expression. She also instituted a rage ritual, a private space where she voiced frustrations into a pillow or scribbled angry letters she never sent. These acts honored her shadow's energy, preventing it from erupting destructively in relationships. By befriending the once feared aspects of herself, Sarah's internal polarization eased, and she no longer unconsciously sought their confrontation in toxic partners. Finally, Sarah formed conscious relationship habits that aligned with her integrated self. She created a compatibility ritual before committing to someone, a month-long period of shared activities and honest check-ins focusing on emotional responsiveness and boundary respect. During this time, she practiced direct communication, asking partners about their needs and expressing her own, rather than defaulting to passive compliance. She also maintained supportive networks, friends and mentors who could offer objective perspectives when she felt drawn toward familiar but unhealthy dynamics. These steps coalesced into a new relational paradigm. When Sarah met Miles, she recognized his consistent empathy and reliability without feeling bored. Her integrated spontaneity found outlets in their shared adventures rather than unmet fantasies. During moments of conflict, Sarah paused to identify her internal triggers, addressing them calmly with clear boundaries rather than lashing out or withdrawing. As a result, her relationships no longer felt like battlegrounds, but arenas for mutual growth and genuine intimacy. Moreover, Sarah's journey illustrates Jung's broader message. Relationships are mirrors reflecting inner work yet to be done. By consciously engaging projections, integrating complexes, and honoring the shadow, individuals can transform their love lives from a cycle of pain into a path of wholeness. Breaking toxic patterns requires patience, self-compassion, and consistent practice, but the reward, authentic connection grounded in conscious choice, far outweighs the seductive pull of unconscious attraction. Ultimately, the key lies in shifting from unconscious repetition to conscious creation. Sarah's path from repeated heartbreak to mindful partnership exemplifies how Jungian insights into projection, complexes, and shadow dynamics empower individuals to choose healthy relationships. Each step, self-awareness, projection interruption, complex healing, shadow integration, and conscious habits, serves as a pillar supporting the emergence of authentic love, free from the chains of the past.